Yeah, and then we're going to begin. So firstly, I'd like to thank everybody who's joining us. This is going to be a very, very important webinar. I think this is an extremely important topic that we need to discuss. And I'd also like to welcome our guests tonight, Dr. Marnewick, Dr. Louise Waal, and Karen Trendler. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to each of our speakers, and from there we're going to dive straight into the questions. I would also like to ask our audience, if you do have questions or comments, please leave them in the chat. We have quite a bit of ground that we need to cover tonight, and so it will be best for us to manage our time most efficiently if all questions and comments are going into the chat, and then we will deal with them at the end of the webinar. Our first guest for tonight is Dr. Marnewick. She has a research background in large carnivore conservation, human-wildlife conflict, monitoring, and trade. She is chair of the IUCN African Lion Working Group and a council member of the Southern African Wildlife Management Association. We also have Ms. Karen Trendler with us this evening. She is a wildlife rehabilitation expert with experience of wildlife welfare, ethics, and trade nature conservation, and training in wildlife management. She was the wildlife trade and trafficking manager for the NSPCA and has consulted for the NSPCA for many years and still operates as an inspector. And then we also have Dr. Louise Waal. She has 36 years of experience, including in academia, sustainable tourism, and the NGO sector. She has also developed a very broad knowledge of wildlife and conservation issues in Southern Africa. More recently, she has focused predominantly on the commercial captive breeding of big cats in South Africa through advocacy, lobbying, and scientific research. Thank you so much for being with us, and I would like to just dive straight into the questions, if that works for the three of you.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Karen, I'd like to be able to start with you first. Why was the Ministerial Task Team appointed by the Minister? Could you just give us some background to that, please?
Well, in 2018, there was a parliamentary colloquium, and the outcome of that, and following that, the Minister then appointed the high-level panel of experts, and their task was to review policies and legislation, trade, etc., on various species, including lion. A year of very intensive deliberation and discussions and stakeholder consultations followed, and the outcome was the high-level panel report, which was cabinet approved, and in that it stated keep lions or use captive lions or their derivatives commercially, and that the Minister was to put in place a process to halt these activities. And there have been various policy processes, strategies, and then the overarching white paper. And then the Minister appointed the Minister's options, pathways from the captive lion industry.
Thank you so much for that. Kelly, I wonder if you could just expand a little bit on what Karen has said and expand on what the MTT's goals were.
Yes, we had three key focus areas. The first one was stakeholder engagement, and the stakeholders were defined as, obviously, the main stakeholder were those involved directly in the captive lion industry, but not only them, it was vulnerable workers in the industry, it was the government departments and conservation authorities, as well as general public. Second of all, we had to undertake an audit of the captive lion industry that included the number of facilities, how many lions are in the industry, as well as an audit of stockpiles in terms of lion parts and derivatives, including bones, and then also trying to get an understanding of how many workers are involved in the industry. And our final focus area was actually developing the exit options, the voluntary exit options, and funding mechanisms for those.
Thank you. Louise, what stakeholders were involved in this process then? Because it's felt like such an expansive process. Who did you engage with?
Yes, it certainly was, Steph. The panel had numerous meetings throughout the year of 2023 with a wide range of people and organizations. As Kelly said, anybody really who had a stake in the industry. So we met with captive lion owners and industry representatives. We met with animal welfare and conservation organizations, wildlife veterinarians, NSPCA representatives, genuine lion sanctuaries, traditional health practitioners, the general public. And as Kelly just said as well, we also focused on more governmental departments, so DEFI, provincial authorities, SARS, and some other departments as well as potential donors. So every stakeholder really brought different expertise to the table and input into the process. So some people were specifically consulted, for example, in terms of input into the protocols that were developed. And we met with sort of lion safe havens on capacity and cost involved relating to the lifetime care of lions. Others had a bigger input in the development of the range of possible ways in which lion owners could exit the captive lion industry. So yeah, overall, it was a pretty well-rounded stakeholder engagement process that happened throughout the year.
That is quite an extensive process. So, Kelly, you mentioned that there was a national audit that was done. Could you explain to the audience a little bit more about how that national audit was conducted by the MTT?
Yes, so we started off with a database of known lion facilities that was brought together from knowledge that was already existing inside the MTT, which then just gave us a baseline of how many facilities there were and how many lions we thought there may be in those facilities. From there, we engaged with the various provincial nature conservation authorities to get their most up-to-date permit records and see what was actually on those permit records. This then also gave us an idea of how things could possibly have been changing over time. But it wasn't quite as simple as just calling and getting the email, the records emailed through to us. It took 3, 4, sometimes even 5 iterations of that database to get a final value that the conservation authorities were happy to sign off on. And we did ask them at the end of the process, so this is what we've got. We went through it with them for their particular province, for each facility, and got them to actually sign off that they thought this was a fair and true reflection of the industry in the province. As part of that process, we were also able to get inspection records from the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, which were records of when their officials worked with the provincial nature conservation authorities to do compliance inspections at facilities. And that gave us further information on how many lions were at a specific facility for a specific audit. And for some of those, we even managed to get audits that were 2-3 months apart, which was really useful in helping us develop trends in those facilities. Where possible, we also got from provinces the number of workers involved in those facilities, but those data weren't very rich. So we only got that for a handful of provinces. And then again, we work with provinces and to look at what is possibly being held in terms of stockpiles, in terms of lion bones, skeletons, and any other parts and derivatives. So it was quite a time-consuming and very thorough process that we went through. We did go to facilities and count lions for many reasons. First of all, time didn't allow for that, and we don't have any mandate to enter facilities and to actually inspect them. And even if we did, we still wouldn't be able to physically count all the lions because you'd need to know whereabouts the lions are. So we felt that the permitting records, in collaboration with the best information known by the provincial nature conservation authorities, were a really true reflection of the number of lions in facilities.
And could you tell us a little bit more about the main findings from that national audit?
Yes, so everyone likes a final number, and our final number was 7,838 live captive lions in South Africa across 342 facilities. What we did discover is that there's high fluidity in that number, and we got that from analyzing auditing records, and that within the space of a month, those numbers could increase by 500% or decrease by 54%. So at any one time, you know, an actual number for the industry is quite difficult to actually reach. It's very fluid. There were about 2,888 whole carcasses that we know of, 292 whole skeletons, and a further 275 skeletons without the skull attached to them that seem to be recorded separately, and about 636 individual skulls, and around about 765 kilograms of lion bone. We also recorded 2,315 other predators on these facilities. That would be things like tigers mostly, leopards, cheetahs, jaguars, etc. But some of the general trends that we've seen over time in the industry is a gradual increase in the number of lions in South Africa, captive lions, as well as an increase in the number of facilities, but at the same time, a decrease in the number of lions per facility. So we're getting more facilities with fewer lions per facility. And in fact, 73% of our facilities had 20 lions or less. So they're reasonably small. The vast majority of facilities are reasonably small. And Northwest Province and Limpopo Province are the key role players in the captive lion industry. And the Northern Cape is the only province that's got no captive lions in it. In terms of looking at workers involved in the industry, like I said, the data was quite porous, but we did manage to get it for 2 provinces. And so what we did was we just had to really extrapolate. So we took the number of workers we had for those 2 provinces. We knew that those provinces had X amount of facilities with X amount of lions. And we just did some extrapolation. If you need so many workers per lion, how many workers would there be in the whole of South Africa? Or if you need so many workers per facility, how many could there be in the whole of South Africa? And that gave us a range of workers from between 1,500 to 2,000 workers in the whole industry.
And that would be across the country then?
Nationally, yes.
Really, thank you. I also understand that the MTT looked at compliance issues in addition to conducting this national audit. So, Louise, could you give us a bit of an indication about what were the main findings with regards to the compliance issues that you saw throughout your time in the MTT? You're on mute, Louise.
That wouldn't be the first time. Hey, you're on mute. Yeah, as Kelly was saying, we were able to get hold of compliance inspection records. Those are actually inspections that were conducted in between the DEFI, Biodiversity Enforcement and Compliance Units, together with the provincial EMIs. And that is over a period of time. And most of our inspection records were from between 2015 to 2023, if I'm not mistaken. And we sort of tried to do a little bit of number crunching on that. So what we found was, this was actually, some of this was actually also done by the department themselves. So nearly 40% of facilities were actually found to be non-compliant. Some of that would be non-compliance in terms of operating with expired permits, without the necessary permit to keep specific species. So maybe they had leopard, but leopard wasn't actually on the permits, or the permits, there were actually more animals on the farm than on the permits. Or there was a non-compliance with conditions that were very specifically indicated on the permit. So, for example, marking of lions, which is a TOPS condition, and then the inspection team would find that a lot of the animals, in particular lions, were not marked, and most of the time that would be done with a microchip.
Okay.
Yeah, and the sad thing is that of the 100 facilities that were actually inspected between 2015 and 2020, only 5 were actually faced compliance enforcement action. So very often those non-compliances with permit conditions were then rectified by, for example, simply advising them to apply for an amended permit that would include that particular species that wasn't on the permit, or increase the number of animals to accommodate any increases due to breeding or trades. So there's very little in terms of an enforcement action when we are actually looking at the compliance within and these sort of inspections. When we were looking at those inspection records, we also started looking at what we would call cost-reflective tariffs. So really looking at the cost relating to the monitoring and regulation of the commercial industry versus the revenue that is generated from, for example, issuing permits. So we did a bit of number crunching, which was quite an interesting sort of exercise, and we worked out that one compliance inspection, looking at how many people were involved and how long it would take them per inspection, including obviously salaries and such, that one compliance inspection would cost about 7,000 Rand per facility. And that would exclude the travel to that facility, because it was too difficult to work out where the actual EMIs were traveling from. It also excluded additional staff costs like the report writing or management time or other administrative costs. So that was a real sort of very basic in terms of cost, and that's just one compliance inspection. So that's basically a fraction of what it costs to monitor and regulate the industry. When we then look on the other side in terms of the revenue that is generated, we can see from the average cost for a permit, a standing permit, which is about 1,000 Rand, transport permit 150 Rand, a hunting permit 2,775 on average. These are all sort of average type of amounts, because it can vary per province. So you very quickly can see that there is a shortfall between the cost to monitor and regulate and the income. And basically that is subsidized by the province's biodiversity conservation budget, which is ultimately paid for by the taxpayer. So that was quite an interesting exercise in its own right.
That is incredibly interesting. So there's an enormous disparity between what it costs to actually apply for that permit versus what it costs to regulate and monitor these facilities. And that shortfall is coming out of conservation budgets and ultimately from taxpayers.
Yes.
Thank you for that. Karen, I'd like to move back to you, and we've spoken a bit about compliance up to this point, but we haven't yet spoken about compliance and welfare. Could you let us know a little bit about your experience on compliance and welfare on the ground?
Well, firstly, before I go into that, my apologies. I'm not trying to go incognito, but the joys of living in Joburg, we have a power and a water outage. So my apologies, I'm not trying to hide. And I thought a torch under the chin might be a little bit scary. Yeah, on the compliance side, from the welfare perspective and the permitting side, our experience on inspections has been much in line with what the MTT report came out with, and that is very poor compliance. So both from a welfare perspective, we're seeing very low welfare standards. We're seeing non-compliance with even the basic 5 freedoms. required for welfare. And then also, you know, when we checking permits for PAPA licenses, trying to tally numbers against the permits when we get the permits, there is a huge amount of non-compliance and very, very poor record keeping and updating of records and updating of permits. And that's across the spectrum.
I know that welfare is quite a difficult thing to be able to conduct those inspections, and you're probably faced with a fair amount of cruelty as well. I wonder if you wouldn't be able to give a couple of examples of the kinds of non-compliance issues you're seeing with regards to welfare.
Sadly, we're seeing very, very basic things that have a massive impact on the animals. Lack of water, dirty water, poor hygiene, where the cages are just packed with bones and old meat and old chickens. We're seeing fighting amongst the animals, overcrowding, poorly maintained cages, poorly maintained gates and management areas. We're also seeing animals that are not getting adequate diets, so nutritional and vitamin and mineral deficiencies. And then in some of the facilities, you see very sad situations where inbreeding is having an impact. So you're actually seeing physical deformities where the faces are shortened, sway back. Sure, the list is endless, but really we are just seeing very, very poor, very, very low welfare standards, and that's generally. There may be a few facilities where the conditions are good, where they have a veterinarian associated, but as a whole, we're seeing generally very poor welfare standards across the sector.
And could I clarify?
And a resistance to changing.
That I would also just like to clarify on that. Are you seeing these non-compliance issues in public-facing facilities where tourists and visitors are welcome to come in, or are these more facilities that are closed off to the public?
In both.
Both
the ones that are closed and public-facing facilities. You quite often find in some of the facilities that there is a public-facing operation where there are tourists visiting the facility, and then there are operations behind the scenes as well that the public never see or have access to.
Thank you for that. Louise, I'd like to turn to you now, and I would like to move back to the report itself. Now, a big part of the report, of course, is the voluntary exit options. So could you give us a brief idea about how the NTT went about developing these voluntary exit options?
Thanks, Steph. Yeah, so obviously the whole stakeholder engagement process was part of that voluntary, developing the voluntary exit options. And that really helped us to put together a list of all the potential voluntary exit options that could exist. And then we did quite an in-depth SWOT analysis on each of them. So that means that we looked at their internal strengths and weaknesses, as well as the external opportunities and threats, which gave us a pretty good indication which of those exit options would be viable and which ones were not so viable. We then also try to score each of the voluntary exit options in terms of its feasibility in achieving the objectives. So that, for example, included reducing the size of the industry or the lowest socio-economic impacts, and the investment in terms of financial and or human resources from a national and a provincial authorities perspective. So all those options were then scored as standalone options, but we would notice that once we started combining them, that the viability could actually be increased. And that led us to a combination of prerequisites and actual voluntary exit options. So that whole process left us with 2 mandatory prerequisites, 6 options that involved live lions, and 2 options that involve lion bone stockpiles. And just to sort of try and also explain that all these options that we identified can be used as standalone, but can also be used as building blocks. So they can be combined. So some lions could be surrendered to a lion safe haven, and some of them could then be traded out. So there are combinations possible, and that gives the flexibility to really create a strategy to suit such a wide range of different circumstances and personalize it. And of course, the entire process was underpinned by socioeconomic impacts, particularly of vulnerable workers, while prioritizing the well-being of captive lions that were involved in the voluntary exits.
And could you outline what that would look like? So what are the exit options? What are the mandatory prerequisites that have been created by the MTT?
So we came up with 2 prerequisites, and that was partly because of the lack of space in genuine sanctuaries for lions coming out of this voluntary exit. And we had to be pragmatic and giving healthy lions a priority. So one of the mandatory prerequisites is humane euthanasia of compromised lions. So a quality of life assessment was developed, and that evaluates the health of individual animals by scoring a range of physical as well as mental health aspects, and helping the veterinarian involved to make an ethically acceptable decision on the future of these lions. So that process then identifies any compromised lions. So that could be old, that could be any lion with diseases and or inbred, and those lions may need to be humanely euthanized. That doesn't mean that we came up with mass euthanasia. It just means that the lions that may actually be suffering would be humanely euthanized by a veterinarian.
Yes.
And then also the second prerequisite is all about population control, preferably by surgical sterilization of both the males and the female lions. As Kelly was indicating, we nearly have 8,000 lions, captive lions in South Africa, and we felt that the population has to be reduced somehow. So starting with the lions coming out of this voluntary process would be a good starting point. So it's a permanent way of controlling the growth of the population. Then from there, we have the 6 voluntary exit options. And Janelle, maybe you could bring up a couple of the graphics to help people to understand and identify what I'm talking about. So basically, there's 2 options with lions. They can either be surrendered or they can stay in the ownership of the facility. And then with that, we have some exit options that are a little bit more viable than others. So the more viable exit options are humane euthanasia of all the lions and a permanent exit. So that means that the owner decides that he or she wants an immediate and complete exit from the captive lion industry and wants to euthanize all the lions. That it can include healthy lions as well. So that is an option that may not be palatable for a lot of people, but it does mean that a lot of these lions are no longer suffering in an exploitative industry. And it also gives it an opportunity. The facility can then repurpose for other economic activities, and that do not necessarily promote domestication of wild animals. Thank you, Janelle, for that. Then The second option is a phase out through trade for a period of 24 months. So first of all, obviously, only healthy and sterilized lions would be part of that. And they can be utilized under the current legal parameters for that limited period. So trade in this instance can include captive lion hunting and the domestic trade in live lions and lion skeletons, parts and derivatives. International trade is excluded from this exit option, and also no tactile animal interaction is allowed, such as petting, for example, or using lions as photo props. And animal welfare needs to be guaranteed during this phase-out period. And for that, protocols were developed specifically. The main strength is that it's an exit option that provides an opportunity for a gradual phase out with an income stream for the owner, and the employees can stay at the facility as well. The third more viable option was the surrender of lions to lion safe havens. As I earlier said, only a small number of healthy lions could really be placed in the care of genuine lion sanctuaries, because there isn't an awful lot of capacity within the existing lion sanctuaries. So this option has a significant price tag attached in terms of relocation and health checks, but obviously also for the lifetime care of those lions. Janelle, could I have the next one of those slightly less viable options, please? Then there's 3 options, and sorry to take quite a bit of time, but this was like the main part of what the MTT was working on. So the 3 slightly less viable options include the surrender of lions to the authorities, which could be both national or provincial. So that means that the owner would actually surrender the lions to the authorities, which will result in an immediate and permanent removal of the lions and exit of the industry. However, it does place the burden and the responsibility for those lions on national and or provincial governments. And we know that those authorities do not have the financial means, and they don't have the facilities either to care for those animals. So this option would most likely lead to humane euthanasia of the lions surrendered as well. So one of the reasons that it came out as a lesser viable option. The next one is, as I said, you know, the number of lion safe havens or genuine lion sanctuaries is limited. So repurposing an existing facility to lion safe haven can be a really positive one. It means that all healthy and sterilized lions can remain at the facility as the property of the current owner. And the facility can then be repurposed, where the animals would stay for the remainder of their natural lives. The facility would have to adhere to no breeding, no human-wildlife interaction, and no buying, selling, or loaning or exchanging of animals in their care. The main strength is that the lions, the workers, they can all stay at the facility, and at the same time they can generate an income stream as well from tourism. But it does require quite a mindset change and change in ethos on the side of the owner, which can be difficult, as well as a substantial investment to upgrade the infrastructure to meet suitable welfare standards, health checks, and also the long-term care. And then The last one is really all about once the lions have been removed from the facility and there's no captive lions left anymore, to then repurpose an existing facility for biodiversity conservation. And that can be achieved through ecosystem restoration, and can ultimately contribute to real conservation efforts, as well as it can support ecotourism based business models. The employees can also stay at the facility, maybe with some retraining, and it also opens opportunities for neighboring farms as well to drop their fences and really create a larger reserve for a range of different wildlife. Weakness is that it requires a substantial amount of investment financially to dismantle infrastructure, creating perimeter fence, land acquisition, and ecosystem restoration. So even though it is a really positive one and can sort of really add to South Africa's biodiversity conservation, it's at the same time also quite a difficult one and therefore a slightly less viable option. And then it left us with two options in terms of lion bone stockpiles. And I will be very quick on that, because there isn't really a lot of choice there. So you can offer domestic trades. There's a very small legal market to traditional belief use. Domestically, that can provide a short income stream. There is currently no CITES export quota for the trade in lion bones, so there is no legal international trade possible. What the MTT recommended instead was that the government would actually buy up stockpiles and mass incinerate, like has been done with, for example, ivory stockpiles in various countries. There is third-party funding available and support for this initiative. And it would really not only prevent potential illegal export of lion bones, but it would also send a really strong and positive message to the world about South Africa's commitment to end the captive lion breeding industry. So sorry for taking this long, but it was sort of the main part of what the MTT worked on.
Oh, absolutely. This is so valuable to understand. And I'd like to now pivot back to the welfare perspective. Karen, are there any voluntary exit options that you feel are creating a bit of uncertainty? And what does this mean then for the welfare of captive lions in light of the exit options that Louise just outlined? You're on mute, Karen.
You'd think by now that all of us would actually know how to unmute. Apologies.
No worries.
I think it's the uncertainty that is getting to everybody, not knowing, is this industry going to finally be closed? Is it going to be voluntary? COVID also caused a lot of uncertainty. You know, the challenges to trophy hunting globally, the changes in the dynamics in that. It's a highly controversial situation. It's in flux all the time. And I think that uncertainty is contributing as well to a lot of the welfare problems, in that there may be limited resources. There is an uncertainty as to how much to invest in it. And I think there's also so many myths and misconceptions, both inadvertently and also being deliberately sped around about what is going to happen with these lions. And that is also contributing to not only uncertainty, but also significant welfare problems.
Thank you for that.
I think, you know, if I can just add,
yes,
the public have sort of a distaste, as we all do, for euthanasia. But I think we need to be realistic about the fact that these lion are bred for hunting and bred for product, and that it is not a stable 7,000 or 8,000 lion. As Louise mentioned, and Kelly, I think, also mentioned, this is a dynamic population that is constantly changing. There are constantly animals exiting the industry, and there are constantly new animals coming into the industry. So I think it's looking at the longer term from a welfare perspective and a conservation perspective. What are the best interests of the animals? What are the best interests for conservation of these lion? And then obviously taking into account the welfare of the workers as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's an important point to make, is that they are primarily bred for trade, whether that be as live lions or for their parts and derivatives, or canned hunts or captive hunts. So humane euthanasia would keep their best interests in mind in comparison to other options.
Sort of, it's really being caught between the devil and the deep blue sea.
Kelly, I would like to come back to you now. Are there any rejected exit options? And could you explain a little bit more about why they were rejected?
I think the most important option that everyone will be asking about is, what about rewilding these captive lions? And it is a proposal that was put on the table by some stakeholders. And there was a PhD study done on releasing captive lions back into the wild. And no one denies that lions can be rewilded and they can be successful in hunting and utilizing their environment. The issue with this option, though, is that there's really no need for it. So there's a lot of misinformation going around about TB and lions in the Kruger Park, and they're all going to die of TB, and that's going to be the end of them, and the captive lions will be a reservoir. And it's completely untrue. All the information shows that TB is not having an impact on lions in Kruger at a population level. And yes, you're going to see the occasional skinny lion who's compromised, but it's not a significant threat to lions in the Kruger Park or lions in the wild at all. So there really is no need for captive lions to repopulate any wild areas. If we were going to have a need to repopulate wild areas, we've got a population of lions in South Africa that we refer to as a managed meadow population, and these are lions in fenced reserves. So these are the reserves that a lot of people would visit for tourism purposes, the places like Welgevondens and Pinders and Pilansbergs, etc. And these lions are have been introduced in most cases to those reserves and are managed. And these lions are wild lions. They're hunting, they're breeding, they're doing what lions should be doing. And those lions are available for reintroduction and restoration projects. And in fact, these lions are doing so well that in many cases, these lions are contracepted, they're vasectomized, they're undergoing unilateral hysterectomies to let them have fewer cubs to try and manage the population numbers of those lions. So we could very easily, as a country, provide significant number of wild lions for restoration projects. So there really is no need to be rewilding these captive lions. And actually the author of that study in our consultation with him said that his lions did breed and they did have offspring, but he couldn't find anywhere to release them again because nobody wanted them because we don't have enough space. So lions breed, lions do really, really well, and there's no need to captive breed them to save them from anything. Lions can breed given enough space and if all the threats to the population are removed. We also consulted with the Lion Management Forum as a task team, and the Lion Management Forum is a group of experts who are involved in guiding the management of lions in fenced reserves in South Africa. And they had a really big concern about the release of captive bred lions into the wild, as they felt this could very potentially create a risk for the good work and the conservation work that's been done through reintroductions. If we start to mix these captive bred lions into a wild population and we blur the lines again between what is wild and captive. And as a result of the good conservation work that's been done, particularly around these reintroductions and management of lions in fenced reserves, in our last red list assessment that helps us understand the conservation status of species, lions were beautifully downgraded from vulnerable to least concern but conservation dependent. And that's purely because of the reintroduction and restoration work that's been done for lions. So lions now are listed in South Africa as least concern, which is a fabulous conservation success. And all of that was done without any need for introduction of captive bred lions. So that's why that was a key exit option that was rejected by the task team.
Thank you so much. That's incredibly interesting. I'm going to move on now to discuss other predators. Louise, I wonder if you could start the conversation. What are the implications for other predators, given that the phase out is being proposed? And then, Karen, if you could continue that to just discuss some of the welfare concerns you're seeing with regards to other carnivores and other predators aside from lions in facilities.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. Other predators were definitely identified by the MTT, by the panel, as an unintended consequence from the voluntary exit of lions from the industry. So basically, it's the unintended consequence that breeders might actually move from lions to other predators, whether those would be indigenous or non-indigenous predators. And those could include tigers, but also cheetahs, leopards, and caracals. And as Kelly was saying earlier, we already have identified a very large number of other carnivores within the industry. Over 2,300 other captive carnivores were identified, and that was only part of the overall industry, because that was partial data that was not based on a complete set of data. And that included over 600 tigers and numerous cheetahs, caracals, servals, a wide range of different species. So we can see that this unintended consequence is already a reality. And therefore, we do believe that the government shouldn't stop at closing the captive lion industry, but extend that to all predators in captivity.
Thank you. And Karen, with regards to welfare concerns for these other predators, both indigenous and exotic, could you elaborate?
We certainly are seeing, to mirror what Louise has said, an increase in the numbers of both exotic and indigenous predators. We're seeing a number of tiger, and then we're also seeing jackal, leopard, caracal, serval, black-footed cat, and new permit applications being issued and new TOPS authorizations and registrations being issued for a wide variety. And then from a welfare perspective, the very concerning thing is the smaller predators are not as charismatic and don't attract as much attention from the public as the lion and the tiger do. But I can tell you that what we are seeing on inspection is equally sad and equally poor welfare conditions for these animals.
And it's incredibly difficult.
So it's a growing.
It's a growing concern, you say?
It is. Most definitely. And we are definitely seeing an increase of both permit issues and the numbers of animals and the diversity, the range of animals in the facility.
Thank you. I would like to slowly start wrapping up the discussion.
Sorry, Stephanie, if I could just interrupt you there and say, you know, something like black-footed cat.
Yes.
Is a concern. We're seeing that a number of facilities, they don't breed easily in captivity. And there's very little record or very little compliance as to where they're actually coming from. So I think there are bigger questions around the conservation and the implications of the other predators. And my apologies for interrupting, but I think we needed to raise that.
No, that's an incredibly important point. Thank you for bringing that up with us. I feel like the welfare discussion is certainly a much bigger one that we should consider having and dedicating a lot more time to that, because there are so many facets to it that we need to be able to consider.
Stephanie, can I add something onto that, please?
Of course, Kelly, thank you.
Thanks. If you look at the CITES records, so CITES governs international trade in listed species, and tigers are listed. And if you look at the CITES records for exports of tigers and tiger products from South Africa, we are seeing tiger trophies, hunting trophies being exported from South Africa. So there really is an indication that there is possibly some form of hunting of tigers happening in South Africa, and the trophies are now being exported from the country. So I think there's very clear indications that there is some kind of replacement market taking place for lions, or maybe even a supplementary market.
Yeah, and if I can add to that as well, is that when Bloodlines together with World Animal Protection did some research, we actually found that, for example, in the Northwest, you don't actually even need a TOPS permit for a tiger hunt. You only need the permission of the landowner to hunt that animal. So it's for that reason, because they don't need a permit, it's even more difficult to actually know what is going on the ground, because there's no permits being issued.
Thank you. Thank you for adding that. That's incredibly important to know. I would like to move on to the next point. I feel like we could definitely talk on a while on that idea, but there's something that has been coming up in the media and obviously in the public quite a bit, and that's the idea of why a voluntary exit only. So, Kelly, I was wondering if you could just expand on that and explain why it's only voluntary.
So, as Karen explained earlier, this task team resulted as an outcome, or a recommendation of the high-level panel report, and that said essentially that lions are not captive bred or bred for their parts and derivatives in South Africa anymore. So the minister felt that a first step in achieving that goal would be to put together a task team to try and find win-win solutions for landowners as well as for their staff. So it really is just a first step in the process to give people an option to voluntarily exit from the industry, as we currently don't have any legislative tools in place where we can sort of use to shut down the industry legally. So it's a first step in the process to long-term closure of the industry.
Thank you for clarifying that. And then along that same note, Louise, again, there's been lots of discussion that this could be the end of the industry. Is it currently the end of the captive lion industry? Could you just elaborate and clarify that for our audience?
The simple answer to that is no, but I'll explain why. So Cabinet has not only approved the MTT report and its recommendations, but they also approved a policy position document that Kelly alluded to as well, with one of the objectives being the closure of the captive lion industry. So that is the sort of the longer term aim of the government. So that was also approved by Cabinet. However, at the moment, there is no real legislation to back that policy document up. And there's no implementation plan or timelines yet for this long-term goal of closing the industry. So at the moment, although the government's intention is to close the industry, legally the industry is still, or the industry is still legal in South Africa, and will remain so until the legislation has come into effect. I don't know, Kelly, whether you have heard anything, or Karen. There was also a draft policy prohibition notice issued last year that would stop the permitting of new facilities, but I don't know whether that has also been approved and been published by the government. Has either of you heard of that confirmation?
I know that the minister did issue it, and I think it might have gone for public participation, but I can't say with any certainty whereabouts it is in the process.
Yeah, it went out for public comment last year, but yeah, I haven't heard. So that probably means that that hasn't quite been published yet. So I don't know. I hope that sort of clarified that issue, Steph.
Thank you, definitely. Well, we have reached the end of our webinar, which means it's time for questions and answers from our audience tonight. And the chat has certainly been quite busy. So I'm going to field a couple of questions. Please don't worry about, I won't direct it to a particular person necessarily. So if you feel like you would just like to tackle that question, let me know. One of the first questions is this one. Is there any interaction or support from other countries in Africa or elsewhere to deal with issues such as cruelty and non-compliance?
I can put a first stab for you. Sorry. There is some, and sadly, you know, some of the first real noise that was made against this industry was actually done by other countries. So Australia, for example, won't allow the importation of any lion hunting trophies, and they state captive hunting as a reason for that. The USA has put in place enhancement findings, and you can only import a lion trophy if you have got one of these findings in place to prove that it was wild and it actually contributed to conservation. And of course, there were all the various campaigns that were done. There was the March Against Canned Hunting and all of those. So I think that was probably one of the big drivers what actually changed or drove change in this industry, which is quite sad. It had to come from outside pressure, and that we as a country couldn't be leaders and leaders from, you know, from where we stand and actually make responsible decisions around our wildlife ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you for that. The next question is an interesting one as well. Would the authorities consider issuing permits for new genuine sanctuaries or lion safe havens? And in the case of existing facilities that transition to sanctuaries, could suitable NGOs get involved as custodians of the wildlife to manage these sanctuaries?
Yeah, I'm happy to sort of take that one to sort of answer the sort of latter half of that question first. There are offers from NGOs and from existing genuine lion sanctuaries to help any facility who would like to repurpose. So that either that would be in terms of retraining their staff into animal husbandry, or in terms of enclosure design and how to look after the animals properly, those kind of things. So there's definitely support from other NGOs and sanctuaries to help in that. In terms of whether or not the government would issue would issue permits to new sanctuaries, that sort of depends on how this prohibition notice will be drafted. And I think in the draft, they try to incorporate that they could still issue permits to genuine sanctuaries. But yeah, it depends. At the moment, yes, they can, because there's no prohibition on issuing of permits to new facilities as yet, but it would depend on what that prohibition notice would actually look like.
Thank you, Louise. We also have a question regarding compliance and enforcement. So Gavin Reynolds has asked two questions. Gavin, I hope that maybe your second question regarding pivoting to other species has at least somewhat been answered. So I'm going to focus first on the compliance question. And Gavin says, whichever exit option is chosen, compliance and enforcement will be key to success. Do you think we can overcome this significant obstacle, and how? A big question.
A very big question. Kelly, do you want to have a first stab at it, or you unmuted yourself?
I've unmuted, yes. Yeah, Gavin, it is a big problem, and I think that is going to be a problem in implementing any of our options, and that came out in our SWOT analysis too, that compliance and compliance inspections and even enforcing compliance is going to be a challenge. We know that our conservation authorities are under-resourced, both in terms of their capacity and in terms of their budget allocation. So it is a weakness in many of our exit options that we don't believe that effective compliance monitoring can be put in place.
Yeah, if I can maybe add to that as well, that we also believe there is a need to add some training for EMIs. Obviously, NEMBA now has a animal well-being clause. Animal welfare and well-being is generally not a skill that is very well developed amongst the EMIs. So that's definitely something that needs to be looked at in terms of training, issuing sort of additional training for those people to help with the enforcement of compliance. But I think also even in terms of the various legislation and regulations that are in place pertaining this industry.
There's also a very interesting question here around the poaching of lions. So I hope that we can try and address this as comprehensively as possible. Is there anything being done to stop the poaching of lions in the wild now that the legal bone trade is being closed? Perhaps we could just clarify that and just expand a little bit on the poaching of lions in the wild.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in here. So we haven't had any legal bone trade for several years now. So there has been no legal bone trade from South Africa. The poaching for lions in the wild for their bones is in fact very seldom been recorded. There were some incidences in Mozambique a couple of years ago, but generally lions, if they are poached in the wild, it's for parts and derivatives. So it'll be for the front of the face, the lower jaw, the paws. And those are all parts that anyway weren't legally exported from South Africa underneath our quota. The minister only provided a quota for whole skeletons without the skull, no bits and pieces. So there never has actually been any legal trade in that for a very, very long time now. And we're not noticing an increase in poaching of lions for their bones as such. Yes, poaching of lions remains a problem, and it's a key concern around lion conservation, and there's many organizations and protected areas working on that. But there doesn't appear to have been any link between shutting down the legal trade of bones from South Africa and the poaching of lions in the wild increasing significantly at all. And poaching for bones, that is, yeah.
Specifically for bones, yes, thank you. There's another question here from Matthew. I have a question about the lion bone options. Am I right in understanding that the MTT has advised that all facilities or owners who wish to benefit from the suggested government buyback of stockpiled lion bone will also have to have their live lions sterilized and go through voluntary exit for them? Nodding.
That is correct, yes. The two mandatory prerequisites, so that is the humane euthanasia of any compromised lions, as well as the sterilization of male and female lions, would still apply if the owner wants to benefit from the exit options for the lion bone stockpiles. So yes, that is absolutely correct.
And just to extend that question, will there be a time frame offered for this? I think we have touched on that, but maybe we could just reiterate the time frame as well.
Time frame has been a really difficult one. So I think with things like lion bones that are surrendered to the governments, it would be a fairly short time frame, and then to a option of the trade out of live lions, that would be up to 2 years. So from the Ministerial Task Team, we were hoping to keep that time frame between sort of pretty much immediate to about 2 years. But we also do realize that that may need to be extended for practical reasons. So yeah, the time frame is one that we have been struggling with, and I think it needs to be really looked at on a case-by-case basis.
I've got 2 more questions here. I think we'll probably cap it at 2 questions if everyone is happy with that. The first one is, how much buy-in is there from the industry, and do we have operators who are volunteering to exit?
I can jump in here if that's okay, Louise. Yes, we do have voluntary exit candidates. They were all treated with the highest of confidence. So actually only the chairperson of the MTT knows who those candidates are in order to preserve their anonymity. And Louise, you remember, I think it was like 11 or 14 candidates. What was the exact number that we had? Because we only had a number. The rest all sits with our chairperson to finalize those exit options with the volunteers.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, it was very difficult, even though in the terms of reference, it kind of implied that we would have to take those people through the process within our term as well. But then we would have to actually apply exit options that hadn't been approved by cabinet and approved by the minister.
Yeah.
So yes, as Kelly was saying, it was all treated with the utmost respect, yeah, now those people will need to be taken through the process, and hopefully we will see some fruit coming out of our hard labor.
And for the second part of that question, I think you said it, Steph, or am I reading it in the chat box? I'm not sure. Apologies.
No,
but
absolutely.
do we see any opposition, envisage any opposition from industry in terms of voluntary exit? Probably not, because it's voluntary. No one's been forced to do anything. So no, not in terms of voluntary exit. In terms of compulsory exit or forced exit, I would definitely expect that. So, and industry has as much that they will fight any compulsory exit from the industry.
Okay. And we have one final question. I would like to know who on this forum are involved in the industry and stand to lose their livelihoods, should this forum then have the power to decide. So it's also quite a big question, but I feel it would be worth addressing.
It is. So we did have on the task team an industry member who was part of the task team, and we did consult extensively with industry. But so in terms of, who's got the power to decide and who stands to lose in livelihoods, this is a much bigger question than only the captive lion industry. The captive lion industry is a very, very small portion of our wildlife industry as a whole, which is a really large industry. And if we look at it holistically, it brings to South Africa the same amount of income as mining does. So it's a very, very large industry that involves ecotourism, it involves bona fide hunting, it's the game meat. It's a huge industry. And what the data have shown is that South African involvement in the captive lion industry is actually creating reputational risk for our country, which means that our entire wildlife industry has got the potential to be compromised because of this really small section of our industry who's doing something that society as a whole finds distasteful. So it's really not only about the livelihoods of those involved in captive lions and captive lion hunting. It's really about the livelihoods of South Africans involved in tourism and our country's reputation and our country's ability to attract foreign income through our wildlife industry as a whole. So it needs to be seen in a really holistic way. It's not about just captive lions. And if we look at the amount of money that's generated from lion hunting in South Africa, captive lion hunting brings in only in single-digit percentages of the money raised by trophy hunting in South Africa. So it really is a very small portion of the income, although we do recognize that lions are often part of a package of more species. So you'll come and get your captive lion, but you'll also get a buffalo and a kudu, etc. But it needs to be viewed very, very holistically.
That is an incredibly important point. Thank you for raising that. Louise, you look like you...
Yeah, I would just like to add to that as well, is that, again, reiterating that we are looking at voluntary exit. Our mandate was purely looking at those people who would like to leave the industry on a voluntary basis. So no coercion, no force, no nothing. Anybody in any business can decide to close their doors from one day to the next. So it's not about losing livelihoods. It's not about whether we are part or not part of the industry. It's about a business decision that individuals are making based on the bigger picture, based on what is happening in South Africa and worldwide. So yeah, I think these are business decisions that individuals have to make for themselves, and whether, you know, we are involved in that industry or not is actually of really no interest at all. We had as Kelly said, we had an industry representative on the panel, and we've engaged with industry extensively as well.
Thank you very, very much. We have run a little bit over time. So my suggestion is that if there's anything in the chat that we haven't yet answered, we will go through those and we'll provide answers, since we do have registrations, emails from the registrations. We'll be able to go through some of those questions. And if we feel like there was something that was missed or not addressed by our three panelists, we will go through that then. I just want to thank each and every one of you for joining tonight. And in particular, thank you, Kelly, Louise, and Karen, for being here and for being able to unpack this incredibly complex, incredibly big process that has just recently come to an end. And I think it's just made a very complex issue a little bit easier to understand, especially for the public who aren't as close to it as we are on a daily basis. So thank you for your input and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for being
everyone.
here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. I'll be ending the call now, but we'll take a look at the chat.
Thanks.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you. Goodbye.
Good evening.